Okay, it is Sunday, January 8th of 2012. I was in the middle of a monologue about how I had been falsely accused of blasphemous libel by Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston. I was going into some of the details about the legal action and my response to it, and the video stopped recording because it ran over its half-hour limit and I didn't notice, so we lost some of what I said. So I'll repeat some of what I said. In short, and I'm sure this is already recorded, but briefly, in June of 2012, specifically Friday, June 1st of 2012, I received an email in my email inbox from Stikeman Elliott, barristers and solicitors, litigation and defamation lawyer, Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, excuse me, which had attached to it a PDF file, which was essentially a electronic version of a paper document that I was later served with by a Montreal bailiff. And it was a cease and desist demand letter in which Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe accused me of the archaic criminal act of blasphemous libel on the basis that I had allegedly made unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association, that is the Unitarian Universalist Association, engaged in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. There was a couple of other accusations that I actually didn't mention what they were in the previous monologue that got cut off, but I will in this follow-up version. Looks like, yeah, we got some more people showing up for the church service at the Unitarian Church in Montreal. Just to go to document that I have a family. It's kind of interesting that we got, looks like a mother and father and two kids kind of thing. So, getting back to things, the other accusations that I did not mention in the previous monologue that got cut off were essentially Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe accused me of, and this is an exact quote, or pretty darn close to exact quote, threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment against women Unitarian Universalist ministers. So that was the general accusation. And then he went in to detail it, and he accused me of saying that a certain Unitarian Universalist minister had had a sodomy fantasy, and that I had said that another woman Unitarian Universalist minister sucked some blows at the same time. According to Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, these two statements amounted to sexual harassment of the two women Unitarian Universalist ministers in question. I would just like to briefly point out that Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, also known as Peace Bang, did in fact have a sodomy fantasy that she posted to her Peace Bang blog. So there was nothing false in my criticizing Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's obscene and sadistic sodomy fantasy, which imagined, and this is an exact quote, or darn close to exact quote, here it goes. Actually, I'm going to spread it out to pretty much the full thing. Here's my sodomy fantasy. South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch. That's Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy, which was posted to the internet on her Peace Bang blog back in, I think, 2006. And I blogged about that. I, in fact, included that in a complaint against Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein about other insulting and defamatory conduct. And this is the interesting thing, is that Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy, as I just described it, is actually much more appropriately described as threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of someone than my criticism of the said sodomy fantasy is. You know, imagining or kind of wishing to see South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch is essentially a rape fantasy, to say nothing of a torturous execution fantasy, because, you know, essentially anal impalement on anything, well, maybe not on anything, because, you know, people do certain things, but essentially, you know, if you were to anally impale someone on the Statue of Liberty's torch of all things, or even a good-sized replica of the Statue of Liberty's torch, you know, that's basically a way of unpleasantly executing them. It's not just a rape fantasy, it's an execution fantasy. You know, I wouldn't myself characterize Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy as death threats against Republican State Senator Bill Napoli, but it certainly includes a wish to see him dead pretty well. So it wasn't an actual threat against him, in my view. However, I can imagine a certain Stikeman Elliott barristers and solicitors litigation lawyer acting on behalf of South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli, construing Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy as constituting death threats against Senator Bill Napoli. I could see Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe doing that. But anyway, I think we've covered that issue enough. I mean, we could go into more detail on it and so on, but let's go to the use of the colloquialism sucks and blows at the same time to describe the two-faced hypocrisy of Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason. Essentially, the story behind that is that one day on Twitter, I saw a tweet by Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, who tweets at Rev Dr. That is, you know, REVDRKMM. So Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, abbreviated. That's her Twitter address. And she was tweeting about hospitality, you know, and about how Unitarian Universalists, you know, must be hospitable. And so I responded to that tweet by, in a fairly civil manner, pointing out to Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason that, you know, unfortunately, there's a whole lot of Unitarian Universalists that aren't all that hospitable. And in fact, they can even be quite hostile. I don't know if I specifically said that, but essentially I said, you know, yes, it's nice to call for, you know, Unitarian Universalists to be hospitable, but the fact of the matter is there's a whole lot that aren't. And that's pretty much all I said. And so Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason's response to that tweet was not to tweet back to me and engage in a discussion about the lack of hospitality of Unitarian Universalists towards the end of promoting being hospitable. No, instead what she did is she blocked me, as many Unitarian Universalists do on Twitter. Not all, by the way. In fact, more and more are not blocking me these days. I've actually got a certain number of Unitarian Universalist ministers, or I shouldn't say ministers, but Unitarian Universalists, certainly Unitarian Universalist congregations, that are not blocking me on Twitter. Now, it might just be because they haven't got around to it, but there's a certain number of congregations, Twitter accounts that I've tweeted to, and then they haven't actually responded by blocking me, so that's a good sign. But anyway, getting back to, Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason's, she not only blocked me, but then she sent out a tweet announcing that she had blocked me. And kind of, I wouldn't say bragging about it necessarily, but basically in a very sort of self-righteous way, announcing, how she had blocked the notorious, Rob and Edgar, as a result of a tweet that was quite frankly pretty civil, just pointing out that, hey, you know what, Unitarian Universalists don't always practice what they preach, kind of thing, So, here she is, on the one hand, saying Unitarian Universalists should be hospitable, and on the other hand, being extremely unhospitable, unwelcoming, when I pipe up and say, hey, well, unfortunately, Unitarian Universalists, at least in my experience and observation, because I've also seen evidence of Unitarian Universalists being unhospitable to other people complaining about the lack of hospitality of Unitarian Universalists. There's work to be done here, essentially, was what I was saying. Instead of engaging me on that issue and dealing with it in a civil manner, no, she just totally silenced me, blocked me, and then announced to everyone else on her Twitter account, that she'd done this. So basically being the antithesis of hospitable. So that's what I call sucking and blowing at the same time. Two completely contradictory actions within a very short time frame, that's what sucking and blowing at the same time means. It essentially means doing something, physically impossible, which is inhaling air and exhaling air at the same time. There's no sexual connotation. Well, there's sexual connotations to dirty-minded people, like, I guess, Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason and the UUA Stikeman Elliott, the litigation lawyer, Matron Marc-Andre Coulombe. Yeah, you got a dirty-minded viewpoint, you might interpret sucks and blows at the same time as being sexual. But in fact, it's not sexual at all. It's about inhaling air and exhaling air. I haven't got around to it yet, but I'm very, very tempted to ask Maître Marc-Andre Coulombe why it is that neither his client, Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, nor himself know the difference between inhaling and exhaling air, and that other interpretation of the words sucks and blows. It's, like, what is it? Aren't you capable of distinguishing the difference between those two things? And pointing out to both of them that, if it was the other thing, if it was the other sucking and blowing, it would not be contradictory. It would not, suit the purpose of what I was using that term from. It would be exactly the same thing at the same time. Whereas I was trying to point out how Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, in her two-faced hypocrisy, did two very, very different things at the same time. So apparently both Kelly Murphy Mason and the UUA Stikeman Elliott litigation lawyer, Matron Marc-Andre Coulombe, lack the intellectual capacity to properly interpret the English language. And apparently they do believe that, well, I think you know where I'm heading, but essentially, they apparently don't know the difference between inhaling and exhaling air at the same time, and otherwise sucking and blowing at the same time. So we've run through that. Church of the Image Tarnishing Ministers. Well, originally it was Church of the Image Tarnishing Minister, and it specifically referred to Reverend Ray Drennan. And this is actually another interesting part of the history of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. So just stepped off the curb there. This was a later addition to my protest. I mean, I could have put out a picket sign like this earlier, but what happened is, on October 9th of 2000, there was an editorial in the Gazette, an opinion editorial, an op-ed piece. And the title of that op-ed piece was Wrong Message. And the person who wrote that editorial, whose identity I did not know immediately, I just started reading the editorial. And essentially what the person was saying was that it was inappropriate that the state funeral for former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau had been a Roman Catholic church service. According to the person who wrote this article, because it was a state funeral, it should have been a secular affair. That Pierre Elliott Trudeau had a right to have a private family Roman Catholic funeral, private funeral, but the state funeral should not have been a Roman Catholic right. And it was actually written in fairly offensive terms. It spoke about the state funeral being a sham state funeral. It was pretty full of self-righteous indignation. Towards the end, it basically took a swipe at pretty much everyone's religious beliefs by dismissing not only the Roman Catholic state funeral, but a whole bunch of other religious rituals as being meaningless rituals. And I'm going like, who is this idiot? You know, who is this asshole writing this shit? And so I looked down at the byline, and there it was, Reverend Ray Drennan. I burst out laughing when I saw